So good morning, everyone. Welcome. This is our last webinar for the semester. So welcome. Thank you for choosing us for your CEU needs. I am Shantae Hatcher. I am helping out on the webinar today. And just a couple of things. One is that you've seen the link go up to sign in to the webinar, and then also there will be another link at the end for you to fill out a evaluation of the webinar. So make sure that you also do that. That is the way that we will know that you attended all the way through, and that that is how we will issue your CEUs. So make sure that you sign in, and then at the end that you fill out the evaluation form. So at this point, I will turn it over to our instructor for today. We have Gisele Ferretto. She has been a long-time instructor here at the School of Social Work. She also works in the field office and our Title IV-E program. So Gisele, I'm turning it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, good morning. I'm very excited to see that there are 83 people in the room. So I'm looking forward to a new way of interacting with participants. And I hope that the medium doesn't interfere with you getting your questions answered. So please feel free to give me feedback as we're going along. I do have specific points during the presentation where I am going to stop and just make sure that you know, I'm answering any questions that you might have. So let's take a look at what our plan is for this morning. Interesting. There we go. So we're going to look at the relationship between policy and social work practice. I'm guessing that if you signed up for this workshop for one or two reasons. One, you already get the connection between policy and your practice, or you're just needing to collect your ethics CEUs. Either one are really good reasons for that. But we're going to focus on what specific ethical issues we'll find some guidance in statute for common situations in our practice, confidentiality, boundaries, all kinds of issues that come up in our work. I'm also going to introduce this, reinforce this concept of risk management strategies for us as behavioral health professionals. And we'll actually take a look at statutes, regulations, and other forms of policy that impact our work. So we'll be connecting back with those lessons in 5th grade, I think, is when they talk about the different branches of government, and specifically on how they, those that are related to behavioral health. And we're going to talk about the process associated with each form of policy. But more important than that, we're really going to do some work at trying to learn how to locate them, how to read them, how to analyze them in our work. And so my strategy, or the method we're going to use, is I'm going to first demonstrate it through sort of slides that are created. And then I'm going to go to a live search for some of the more frequent statutes and regulations that impact our work as a tool. So it's just really important. There'll be points where I have a lot of people come up to me after workshops and say, oh, do you have a dual degree? Are you also an attorney? I'm not. I just see the value in policy and statute. Many times as a worker, I found that when I went to had a question and went to my supervisor and administrators, they would pull out these big blue books and pull out these burgundy books, and often the answer to the question I had was contained in them. So I began to be very interested in really identifying those as a way to begin to answer some of the questions in social work. If we're honest, no law or policy is going to completely answer the questions that we have in our practice, but they are a really good place to kind of start. For those of you who have gone to workshops from me before, you know that it's important to me that you leave with your questions answered and with one skill that might aid you in your work. Have a lot of respect for the work that we do, and any tools that we can identify is certainly my goal. So I'm a little bit reluctant in a way to be on the webinar, because I want to make sure that that you're committed to letting me know as we go through the material, because I can't see your faces to know if I'm going too fast or something is unclear. So, all right. Not sure why. There we go. So these are some of the issues that where we find statute and other policy most related, I think, to the work that we're doing. I'm hoping that as I go through my list, that maybe you can think of other areas that you feel that laws or other policy impact on your work, and I'll add them to my list, and we might actually look up some of those as well. But certainly confidentiality, not just records, but information related to that is informed consent. What is an informed consent? Certainly all those responsibilities, those ethical responsibilities we have around reporting child maltreatment, the vulnerable adults, the exploitation or abuse, neglect, self-neglect of vulnerable adults. And then this concept of duty to warn or duty to protect depends, in the literature they use both of those terms around this concept that we also have a responsibility to protect people that we may not even know their names, but these are people that our clients identify in our work, and so we also have a responsibility to protect them as well. When we're describing what our relationship is, not just our scope of practice, but what are appropriate relationships for clients, we'll find a lot of language actually in our regulations, which we'll take a look at, that describe what are these areas that we need to control for around boundaries. We certainly understand the concept, but we'll find in statute and in regulation what are even the categories of those potential dual relationships. What are the limitations of our practice and scope of practice? I think it's important also to know that as the laws change, and we are going to look up the social work licensing statute that just changed last year and went in effect July 1, 2018. So, it changes our scope a bit. And so we also need to be an advocate for our profession by knowing how are they defining our practice and how can we be involved in really writing and advocating for what we feel is our scope of practice. I think that's really important, as there are other behavioral health professionals and other medical professionals that are, on the surface appear to be doing very similar functions as we in social work. So it's important, I think, that we define that practice, that scope of practice. Certainly the rights of clients, we need to be aware of what rights they have so that we don't violate them. And if you're working with minors, there's a section in law that speaks specifically to what rights minors have. And so we need to be aware of those as well, even if we're working with families and there are minors involved. Advocating for clients, I remember in my work in Child Protective Services, there were opportunities where I had a chance to, collaborate with school officials. And so it was really helpful for me to know, what are the legal definitions of certain disciplinary actions as I'm trying to advocate for a youth that may be exhibiting behavior in the classroom that's really more trauma related. um, so I need to know what are the definitions of, what's an excused absence, what is the levels of discipline to be able to advocate. And there's many of places in our work where we are advocating for our clients. We may know, or our clients may have criminal charges brought against them, and it's really helpful for us to know, what are those, not, we're not their attorneys, but it is helpful to know the context of these laws that are impacting on our clients in ways where we're trying to advocate for them. Certainly one area that has really changed, and additional requirements around supervision, specifically supervising someone for their social work advanced licensure. So being up to date on what those changes are have serious consequences for beginning social workers. It's not uncommon, if they haven't correctly filled out those forms prior to collecting the hours of, what is the clinical social work experience hours. It's not unusual for the board to deny, up to 1,000, 2,000. They can deny the hours because it wasn't documented correctly, and that certainly has an impact on, you know, uh, people's advancement. And so we want to make sure that we are providing supervision. There's specific topics that have to be included in the supervision hours, and so we want to make sure that we're following that if we're involved in, supervising any social workers for advanced licensure. Certainly keeping abreast of the continuing education requirements, and they do change from time to time. Luckily, Shante keeps abreast of those, so we're informed in that way. But also knowing, so now we know that the supervisor, if you are a board approved supervisor, to stay on that list, to be approved, you now, every time you renew, will also have to have 3 CEUs in supervision, in addition to those 3 ethics supervision requirements. So we just want to keep abreast of that. And also in our programs, just the very definition of who is a client and what services can and can't be provided by your agency. Again, part of our role of advocacy can change those definitions. We're seeing that even in the policy around sexual assaults on at higher education, that those policies are being rewritten to be much more, well, I don't want to have a political opinion about it, but they're being rewritten so that there's more, the perception is that there's more balance in terms of the person who is bringing that concern forward. So it's really important how we're defining who is eligible for what, because it really does impact on our role. I'm wondering if other people, while I was going through the list of sort of me brainstorming with myself, if there are other issues that people have identified as where they find that laws are impacting on their practice. So I don't see anything on the chat, but I'll leave that sort of question out there. And if you do think of other ways in which laws impact on our practice, Oh, HIPAA. Okay, great. So we'll definitely talk about that. So that's related to confidentiality. Certainly, yes, someone also identified texting and email. So the new NASW Code of Ethics that went out in January of this year, a lot of changes occurred around technology. There were 37 changes, and 36 of them related to technology and use in social work. And we'll also talk about the regulations that are being well, they're in draft form right now around teletherapy. So I would invite, if any of you are working in the area of teletherapy and are interested in reviewing those draft regulations, to shoot me an email, because I don't work in teletherapy, so I don't know if the language being proposed is a problem or not. So I would appreciate your impact. So certainly insurance requirements and fair housing laws. Yes, and we talked about reporting child abuse and adults in our second bullet. So great, thank you. So when thinking about, we've identified some areas that impact our work that are related to laws. And now we're sort of looking at, how are they, why are they important in our work, and how are they important in our work, and in what ways do we use them? And this is, since we're, okay, so I'm going to stop paying attention to the Yes, I will provide my email, maybe when we're taking our lunch break. I should have actually said what our agenda was, so sorry about that. So at 10:15, 10:15 to 12:30, we'll take a 15-minute break. It's not really a lunch break, but we'll take a little break. But I will definitely send out my email if you're interested in those, having input on those draft regulations. So some of the ways that law and policies are important in our work is that they express some core values of society and of our profession, if you're looking at our specific regulations or that govern social work practice. But we can tell a lot by what we value as a society, what is important in terms of how are we describing rights or eligibility. It's we don't often think about it that way, but it really does communicate to others what is important. It also helps us to identify what are expected behaviors. What is the outcome? What can we expect when a particular behavior occurs? So that's an important piece about making sure that people understand what are those consequences for behavior not being identified. I think it also provides a language. Sometimes some of the questions that we have in our practice, I realize come from, I don't want to say conflicting definitions, but different definitions, sometimes for the same term. So it might be that the word child or minor is described in different ways in different statutes, and so there's some confusion. If you're working in one area and you're used to a particular definition of what is child, and then there's another set of laws that might give more rights to a child, a minor. We got two different definitions of child, and so sometimes you may be and working in a multi-professional perspective, there may be either disagreements or people coming from different perspectives, sort of assuming that the other side is incorrect because we have a different operating definition of what we might think are really simple terms. The definitions, there's a criminal definition for child abuse and a civil definition for child abuse and child neglect. So sometimes there's confusion around that. So we'll also do a little search around that as well. And hopefully, so you can all tell that I'm a policy nerd, probably when you're looking at this list of how important I think laws are in our work. But one of the policy written at its best is really trying to control for personal bias. Now we know that that's a powerful force, the personal bias, and structural systemic bias, but and discrimination, and we need to control for that. But the goal is really to set if this is the specific definition, really trying to minimize the times where a person interjects their own personal perspective on behavior. One of the ways it also is helpful for us specifically in our work is I think it socializes new workers. It's really important for us around, professional development of professional self. That's a big part of what field instructors are providing, and new and social worker supervisors of new social workers is really helping them to develop this professional identity. And so a lot of that is, looking at scope of practice. And then it really hopefully sets some ethical standards to measure conduct. So if there's some beginning clarity of what are the definitions of things and what can we expect from them to happen, it's really a standard for us to measure conduct. So if we're looking even at boundaries or dual relationships, there's some way for us to, measure and look at, what a violation is, or to be able to set some standards of what our values are, even as a profession. And then another important piece of it is it really allows or provides, what is the foundation for a complaint. And for, in terms of trying to equalize some of the power between client and practitioner, that it allows for, someone to say, well, if this was the standard and this is the definition, having a way to appeal decisions that are made. So hopefully I've convinced you all, so that this is an important piece for us to explore, at least for the next 2.5 hours. So I want to, for those of you that have come to workshops of mine before, you know that I often raise up this issue of minimizing risk. Very often when you ask a social worker to define risk, the first place they go is thinking about, if they're working with the elderly, minimizing the risk of falls. If you're talking to professionals that are working with children, they're looking at minimizing the risk of maltreatment. I'm sure that in working in community practice, looking at, community violence. So when we talk about risk, in that context, we might think about the things that we do in community practice to try to limit the risk. Well, that's not the kind of risk I'm talking about. When you talk to other medical professionals and you talk about the word risk, they understand, or the first definition that they often come to is really thinking about risk from a professional perspective. What is my risk in terms of liability around a particular action? So I want us to kind of think about that for a moment. And it's not about covering up bad practice. Nobody is interested in that. We want to uphold and, build our practice and profession. But we also want to recognize that there would be helpful for us to begin to think about what are some things that we can do as a professional to actually protect ourselves and to minimize the risk that we have as a treatment provider. So some of the things we want to think about, lots of times there's concern if there are particular personal biases or boundaries, and you're much better off if there is some um, prior relationship or a strong bias that you share with your supervisor. That's a good thing to identify where personal self may be interfering with the work that you're doing. Seeking assistance from colleagues and supervisors to control for that is really a good thing, to kind of be anticipating what is the perception. So again, we know with our ethics and dual relationships, it's not just an actual dual relationship, but it's the perception of that or potential. So establishing, identifying those ahead of time only makes us stronger. As we identify them, then you can actually come up with strategies to control for them. Knowing what the standards of the profession is really important. And the ways that we do that are varied. One of the ways that I do that is I'm a member of NASW Maryland. And when you're a member, you get these, emails from National. And they maybe come like once every couple weeks, and it just keeps me up to date. So I know when they're changing things. They're in the process now of developing new standards around confidentiality in social work. So I'll be kind of keeping my eye out for that. Because you want to make sure that you are practicing within the standards of the profession. And other ways, if you're working in the area of child welfare, you might be on the listserv for the child welfare information gateway. That's another national organization that sends out monthly updates on what are the changes in that area. So I would welcome us if you are familiar with a particular like how do you keep up to date with your area of practice, and if you want to just jot them down in the either I guess in the chat. That might be helpful for all of us to be sharing, how we keep up to date with the standards of our profession, because that's the standard that you're going to be evaluated on. Is what is the what has the profession, what, and they look to NASW Maryland, not NASW Maryland, they look to NASW National really for what is the standard of what is expected behavior. And current knowledge and intervention. So again, we want to keep track of, I find these kind of getting on listservs of these, reputable national organizations is really the most helpful in sort of keeping me up to date. And so today, really knowing relevant statutes and regulations and policy. Again, this is not about teaching you how to be an attorney. It's about helping us to understand, what are the laws that impact on our work, and to be a little more comfortable with searching for these legal references. So where our questions are more full when we are seeking legal advice on specific cases, either through our, by supervisors or attorneys in our agencies. But we need to have this sort of basic understanding. When you renew your license, if you're a licensed practitioner, if you look at the regulations for our licensing, they reference other laws that we are promising we're, adhering to. And so we at least need to know what they are. The best way to really minimize your risk is your consultation with supervisors and colleagues. I have found that very often people don't document that they're meeting with supervisors, or if they have like a case consultation team, if they're in private practice. And it really is important to keep some record that you are consulting, with supervisors and colleagues. It'd be great if you could actually put it in the actual record. It's, I think very often we document our decisions. For many years of reviewing records, I've seen that as a pattern that, social workers document a decision, rarely do they document any support of the decision, or they don't really document that there were multiple options to take, and then this particular option was selected because of X. And I don't think it has to be a lot, but I've done some work with attorneys and social workers that have been sued or licensing violations, and by reviewing records and providing consultation around them, and very rarely is there any, you can't tell what thoughts someone put in making a decision. Also, there's really no references to either standard procedures and so these are all things that really help us as professionals. You could also create it doesn't have to be fancy, but even a Word document that you keep that sort of explains, what are the things that you consider when making X decision. So if there are particular decisions that you're finding that you're making a lot in your work, you might want to get together with your colleagues and sort of decide, well, what are the things we consider? We consider, developmental stage. We consider, all the things that go into making a decision, and then that could become sort of a little bullet list. And then anytime in your records you've identified that X decision was made, you could support that by saying, oh, this is the standard procedures when looking at, when making this particular decision, these are the things that we consider. Larger agencies and certainly bureaucracies often create these forms, particular assessments, and that's a good thing. That really does protect the practitioner, because you completed X assessment that had you look at all these different areas, and then that's how you made the decision. So that's a important piece to kind of keep in mind as well. So the standard that we're held to when you're thinking about our level of risk, that's a horrible topic to bring up on a lovely Friday morning. But anyway, thinking about that, I want to sort of lower any anxiety that might have been prompted by that statement or that last slide, is that they're really looking at, the level of liability is really what is the process, what would people in your profession with similar training or the same training under similar circumstances, what would they have done? So we've got 107 attendees. So if you were in front of me and I said, how many of you think that it's okay to have sexual contact with your client? Just raise your hand. The very fact that no one would raise their hand is sort of the litmus, right? That's why it's so important to talk to supervisors, to get with colleagues, because you're really looking to see, what is the standard. That's again why they always look to NASW is, what is the standard? What should a professional be doing? So it's not, the social worker of the year in the whole, in the whole country or even the world. That's not the standard. The standard is, people with similar training, similar circumstance. What would what would be the process for coming up with a particular decision? And often one of the places they go to is looking at, what are the steps in making a decision, as well, really applying ethics to any decision that you're making. So one of the first things that you think about really is, is, is there some statute that applies in this situation? Because if there is, that's the answer. And so the easiest example would be to give is suspected maltreatment. So if there's a situation where we suspect that a child may be may be maltreated, um, it's a very difficult situation. It may be a client that we've been working with for a while. It might be, so we might be an adult we're working with and they disclose something and then you have to report them. So I'm not saying it's certainly a difficult situation, but there really is no decision making. We are bound to report suspected maltreatment. And so there isn't any, we don't need any steps to decide on the decision because a specific statute exists and it guides us in what our action is. And I'm not saying it's an easy action, but it's pretty clear what we need to do in situations where the law is pretty clear. In situations where the law is not clear, it doesn't address a particular situation, or there are multiple statutes, that's really where, that might apply in that situation, that's really where there is a process of ethical decision making. So the next slide, I provided a model. There's all kinds of models out there. This one I find particularly useful. There's a book that's kind of that's relatively reasonable. I think it's like $12 that kind of talks about this particular model. But any agency might have a particular model around ethical decision making, which is fine. Whichever model you're using or reference, all of them are going to ask you what relevant laws or agency policies are speaking to any option or alternative that you've identified in terms of what your decision is going to be, what's your action going to be. So since all of those models identify statutes, and because again, if the law is pretty clear on action, then that is the action. And you can plan for best ways to implement that, but you really don't have a choice in implementing that action. So, and that's really what brings all of you here today, I'm hoping. So, what we're going to do now, there was a kind of quiz that was sent around as a handout. If you don't want to open that up, that's just fine because I made slides for each one of these questions. Because what we're going to do is after we look at each question, I'm going to give you a moment to sort of, nobody's going to be handing it in or checking it, but to sort of think about what the answer would be. Then we're going to actually, after I demonstrate the process, I have the list of all of them identified. It's 14. And then we're going to go and look them up specifically. If you want to write down this, because I'm going to give you the specific citation, that would be helpful if you want to write down the specific citation. But I would encourage you to try to refrain from actually copying all the content or the answer on each slide as we go along. This is not a workshop that's going to cover all these areas in the laws. I do provide workshops that sort of go in more in depth with what is that specific law, or even like in confidentiality, the different confidentiality laws that we find, in our practice. That's not the goal of today. The goal of today is to help you feel more comfortable finding these particular sections in law. The citations will never change, but the laws do. And so, for example, the definitions of child abuse and neglect have changed over the last few years. I know that if I'm interested in keeping up to date, I'm always going to look at Family Law 5701. I'm always going to go there because that's where I'll find the definitions. So even though I put up definitions on these slides, who's to say that next year during the session that those laws aren't changed? So what's more important as we go along is that you identify the citations, And if you miss them in this section, no worries, because we're going to come back to that at the end. As we do our searches, we're going to actually look for that. All right, so if any of you want to brave it out, you're welcome to also put it into the chat, but it's okay if you don't want to. But somewhere on a piece of paper in front of you, just what do you think, where would you, what's the legal definition of a clinical personal note? And where might you find that specific definition? So I don't know if any of you use or in your practice write personal notes around client impact, but give you a second here to write down, what do you think is the legal definition of a clinical personal note? And just jot down whatever you're thinking somewhere, and then where would you look in the law if you were wondering what that definition was? Anybody want to be brave enough to type something in? Give you one more minute. You're welcome to put, someone's asking if I want you to put your answer out on the chat. You don't have to. You're welcome to, but so someone is, I love social workers. We're so brave. I love it. That they've never heard of the definition of a personal note. So that's good. Well, then I at least know you'll be happy when you leave today, because I'll give you the legal definition and where to find it. And I would say that these questions that I came up with are either from actual cases or areas where I think we are a little bit, that we're not really that strong in social work in really knowing where in the law there are definitions of particular things. So someone's mentioned COMAR 10. 10 is the Department of Health. So do you know, it's a really big chapter. So anybody want to take a stab at maybe where that might be? But when in doubt, that's a really good place to start. That's the where the Social Work Board falls under the Department of Health. All right, so this is where y'all gonna have to let me know if timing is okay. So I'm gonna go to the next slide because I think I've given people a chance to sort of reflect a little bit. Again, please don't try to write this all. We're gonna search. If you look down at the bottom, I have two different ways that the law is listed. It's Health General 4307. And I went so far as to give you the exact line, which is A6, but it's okay. Even if somebody just gave you Health General 4307, you'd be able to find it. The first way that I reference the law is like the official, hotsy-totsy way. So like if, as a lawyer, that's the official citation. As a practitioner, most of us really just use the second way. So it just says Health General 4307 A6. And again, you don't even need the A6. I just wanted to give people the specific section. And again, I'm going to move a little fast, but I do workshops on specifically confidentiality, where we really talk about legally what is a personal note and what makes it not a personal note. But primarily, they're pretty clear. That if you, most of the time, it's really your own, like your questions. So if you're working with a client and you're wondering, they may be depressed, or maybe this is you know, it might be an eating disorder, it might be this, like you're trying to understand, and you might have two operating, you know, theories in a way of what is the clinical issue. And then you go to your supervisor and say, you know, I've noticed these particular behaviors, or the client has said this particular thing, and I'm, you know, I'm trying to assess between this and this. That's a personal note. But it's not things that you don't want in the actual record, because this is protected and it doesn't become part of, you know, when you're subpoenaed or in court cases. So I can say that a lot of times what people think is a personal note, or even the way they describe them, is not legally acceptable, and all those become then part of the, they're admissible because they really weren't personal notes. Just because you personally keep them, which is usually what the definition of what practitioners say, if they even know, is it was a personal note. Those notes that I keep not in the record, that's really not a way that you want to describe it. But anyway, so if you were to say you keep personal notes in accordance with Health Journal 4307, you're describing, that's a stronger statement. All righty. So how long is assigned, you know, if you have a release, you ask a client to sign a release for information or disclose information, this consent form, how long is that form in effect when you ask them to sign it? And where might you find that? What legal citation would you quote for that? I'll give you a second to either just jot down your own notes, or to think about, you know, what even if you don't know where in the law, what would you, how would you answer that question if a client asks you, or someone else, how long do you keep a consent form? 12 months, a year, 1 year unless specified, must be clearly stated. These are all good. So the answer is, they may not exceed longer than a year, even if you say in your form it lasts for 5 years. It doesn't, because legally it's only in effect for 1 year. There are a few exceptions, so you may be working with a criminal justice referral, or you may be a social worker in a nursing facility. So there are a few exceptions, but in general, the and Health General 4303. Again, I went so far as to give you like the exact line, but very often when people are referring to sections of the law, they don't go as to, you know, Health General 4303 is good when referencing that. So what law governs the confidentiality of mental health information in Maryland? So as a practitioner, you are, you know, our information is, you know, mental health information. And if you're practicing in Maryland, what is the law that governs your practice around confidentiality? So I'm thinking that the level of time that I'm giving you for each question is good. So I'll give you a couple minutes. So let me know if the pace is not good.
And Gisele, can I say one thing?
Yeah.
We can sense if you are not on the webinar. It shows up and it will sometimes take people out. So please be mindful of the time. If you are toggling between different pages, we can see that it will show up as a timer to say that you're not paying attention to the webinar. So be mindful of that, because we've been getting calls that people are being dropped off because they are timing out because they're not on the webinar. So I just wanted to let everyone know that. Thank you.
All righty. So again, you're going to let me know. We've got in. Okay, so we saw a couple. So let's take a look. A lot of people say HIPAA, and that is sort of our natural reaction to say HIPAA, because pretty much every doctor's office that you go to gives you the HIPAA policy and all that. I love it when I go to different medical providers. Well, I don't love going to medical providers, but I really do like when they hand me the materials, the informed consents, because I know which ones are really in in full practice. So if you were to answer the question and say HIPAA, you're basically admitting that your practice is around confidentiality is substandard, because HIPAA is good, we're all going to follow HIPAA, but HIPAA is not as specific and doesn't include as many things as Health General 4301. And I said at SEC because that means all of it. Health General 4301, Health General 4302, Health General 4302. 303, and I'm going to show you what it looks like, so it'll make more sense as we go further on in the content. But if you just say HIPAA, you're admitting that your practice is not up to the legal standard. So Health General 4301 is the confidentiality law in Maryland that is for all health, including mental health information or records. And so that is the higher standard. Now, if you pull up Health General 4301, you're going to want a breakfast bar, some kind of protein bar, and a big jug of water to get through all of it. It's a very lengthy law, but you'll find HIPAA in it. You'll find references to the HIPAA content in it, but there's more that's not covered in HIPAA. So that's why I'm saying if you say you're following HIPAA, you're not following all of it. So it's important that your practice is in line with Health General 4301. I think for the general public, like if you had a signed release form for your clients, or if you're explaining to your clients the confidentiality, concept, and you tell them that you follow in accordance with, you probably want to use the word HIPAA too, and Health General 4301, because everybody sort of equates confidentiality with the word HIPAA. Okay, so under what conditions does a minor control their behavioral health care information and not their legal guardian? So someone has a, well, we were actually, someone had a question regarding like the relationship between federal law and state law. Federal law is a good thing, but what happens when when the state law is more specific, and there's a couple examples of that where I'm going to show you later on, you follow the more specific, and that's going to be state law. But I'll show you a couple examples of where we do that. And you'll find that they're not conflicting information usually. It's just more detail in it. So under what conditions does a minor control their behavioral health care information, not their legal guardian? So you can have a minor, if you're working with families, where again, they're still living with their legal guardians, but they have certain rights. And so if they have sought treatment that they have a right to get, the adult may not even realize that they are seeking that treatment, and that may not be shared with the parent. So someone said 16. Okay. So I'm going to move along. So There are, and again, this is not that workshop where I'm going to get into a whole lot of detail, but I do want to just kind of answer the question. These are the places where you need to look if you are working with minors. So certainly a minor who is 16 years old, and a few years ago they tried to, Maryland tried to get that to 14, and they've been trying for years to lower that age, but they haven't been successful. So we probably want to keep track of that as well to try to help advance that along. But it's the thing that's a little confusing is if a minor is 16 years old and the parent brings the child in for treatment, then it's the parent. If the minor comes on their own, then it's the minor. So again, it depends on the circumstances. But the section that talks about minors is Title 20 in Health General. So Health General 2104 specifically talks about mental or emotional disorder. For rights of minors. There are other sections in Health General, and I have them down the bottom under also, because it talks about treatment for health-related problems, or treatment for, if the child is seeking an abortion. There's even one on tanning, if they want to go to a tanning booth. So you just want to, if you're working with minors, you probably just want to hang around, take a look at Title 20. And again, I do a presentation that gets into more detail. That really wasn't the focus of what today's activity is. And then it talks about, also it describes minor in that section, which is really important because, if the minor is married or has a child, they're automatically considered an adult when making healthcare decisions. So that's kind of an interesting concept as well. Lots of times in social work, this can really complicate issues, especially in child welfare. When a child, a minor, is a parent. So again, you just want to make sure that you take a look at that. And if that is an area that you're interested in, then we can, you can sign up for another workshop that gets into a little more detail. It does get a little sticky because, again, very often minors aren't described their rights in that way. But you can decide. You can decide as a program if that's important or not. And it is important to mention in Health General that this section, General 2104, is the only place that mentions an age, 16 years old or older. In the other sections, they do not mention an age. So treatment for health-related problems, there is no age. So it's any minor in that one section. So each facility could decide, we're not going to treat minors under 12 or under 11 or whatever you decide as a program, but this would be a place that you would probably start with Title 20. Okay, true or false, only a licensed behavioral mental health care professional is bound by law to keep mental health information confidential. True or false? So this should be an easy one. Okay, so false. Everyone, if you go to Health General 4302, it talks about redisclosures. Everyone really is bound. Now, there are specific requirements around healthcare professionals, certainly, but healthcare information and records are protected. So even if you have, somebody coming in to clean your office, or they're doing some painting the office or whatever, they're also bound if for some reason they hear confidential information just being in your space. Okay, what's the difference between substantial risk of sex abuse and suspected sex abuse? And what are the reporting requirements for each? And the legal citation? Anybody want to take a stab? Suspected is mandated. CPS report for both. So a few years ago, they there was a, well, actually it was like 2010, but there was some concern around children who were living in homes where there was someone who was on the sex abuse registry. So this term of, substantial risk of sex abuse was developed. And again, that's a different workshop. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but just, yes, you are mandated to report suspected child sex abuse. And of course, that's going to be in Family Law 5701. You don't need the why, but the why just tells you the exact line where you'd find that definition. You are not mandated, but you could report substantial risk of sex abuse. And all that is that the child is residing in a home where there is a known sex offender, and that child is not their biological child. And CPS will, when they respond to the substantial risk of sex abuse, they're not going to go in with a CPS investigation. They'll first determine if a CPS investigation is needed. Because again, just because someone is on the sex abuse registry and residing with children that are not their biological children is not automatically, it doesn't mean that that child is being sexually abused. But okay. What confidentiality law should a behavioral mental health provider in private practice follow? I don't know if we have anybody in private practice. I'm just assuming with the number of attendees that we've got some of you in private practice. Okay. So it's the same section we had talked about before, Health General 4301. Mental health information or records is considered the same, they don't define the setting. They define the nature of the information and the nature of the record. So it would be, it is strict. So someone did identify that it's strict, but it's just as strict as any other setting, because the laws around confidentiality really focus on the type of the information rather than the location of it. And there's actually confidentiality law that's more strict than the Health General 4301, and that's child abuse and neglect information. So that has more limited, that's even more restrictive than behavioral health or mental health information. That's in a different section of law, but we'll keep moving along. What is the law in Maryland which describes what is commonly referred to as the duty to warn? So if someone says duty to warn and you had to explain that criteria, what would you think of, or what would you say for that? And for my colleagues that pay attention to the agenda, no worries. I'm going to keep sticking with this process, and it's all good. So, so I see a lot of Tarasoff responses, and Tarasoff is really from California. I think it was in the 70s that court decision came up. So that's more relevant for California than for us in Maryland. Okay, so hardly anybody knows this, so be happy you'll at least have a couple of answers from going through this workshop. It makes me happy. So the law in Maryland that describes what is this duty to warn, and again, sometimes in the literature is called the duty to protect, is in Courts and Judicial Proceedings 5609. And that specifically describes, what is our duty to warn. For those of you paying attention to the NASW update, they did change, in addition to the technology changes, they made one change in duty to warn. And so this is a good time to be a practitioner in Maryland. The national NASW code took out the word specific individual and just made the based on this one court case. I don't want to go too far in it, but there was a court case in Washington State that the psychiatrist was held liable for not reporting duty to warn protection, but his client never mentioned specifically who he was going to hurt. This particular client killed a woman and two of her children, but the patient never mentioned the names. So if you read the decision, it would be, well, who would he even be protecting? But anyway, he was found guilty. And so NASW National changed the code of ethics to include the duty to be any individual, even if they haven't been identified. The good news is in Maryland, there's 4 states that actually took the time in statute to define what they meant by duty to warn. And so that Washington State case doesn't apply to us. So for us, it really is, you'll notice there's a couple places where it says specified victim or group of victims. So that is, we're in Maryland, we're only bound if a client were to mention a specific person or a specific group, because our state went to the trouble of describing it. For those states that don't have a law that describes duty to warn, then they would be bound by the Washington state law and the NASW Code of Ethics that really says it doesn't matter if the person specifically identified an individual or not. Okay, so kind of in the same light, the duty to warn law in Maryland covers situations when a mental health professional is permitted to disclose if a person is a threat of physical harm to self or others. So that would be a true or false. And what legal citation would you find that in? Or, how would you answer this question? What piece of law might you go to? Okay, I hope I gave you enough time there. False. The duty to warn law really talks about, or the duty to protect, the Courts and Judicial Proceedings 5609 really talks about when your client identifies a specific person, and so you're not really protecting them. They're identifying someone else that you are required to get them help. Sometimes people misinterpret the law around there is a law around an emergency petition. We can petition for an emergency evaluation if your client you feel is a danger to themselves or others, and that's in Health General 10-622. So I wanted to give you that one. So if depending upon your practice, you might want to review both of those laws. Where are the specific types of relationships which are considered a boundary conflict defined? So as a social worker, where would I go if I wanted to identify what are the different kinds of categories? So I'm going to mention one, sexual, right? That would be an area, a relationship that I can have with a client would be sexual. So what are some other types of relationships that we as social workers can't have? or what might be considered a boundary. If anybody wants a stab. Business, buying gifts, financial. Yep, financial gain, treatment of relative. All right. So the specific types of relationships are defined for us as social workers in 104203, specifically 104203, which we'll look at later. So if you don't, if I'm just talking gibberish, no worries. But 104203 is the specific section. It's called Code of Ethics for social workers and social work licensing. And the section 06 is specific, and I gave you the paragraph, which is B, that talks about what is, what areas where you could have a conflict. The first section is pretty, easy. That if you're impaired by mental, emotional, psychological, pharmacological, substance abuse, or personal problems, I think we can all understand that. I guess it was about 6 years ago they had changed this section in the regulations, and I had written in a comment because there's a couple of terms I don't understand in here, and I really have tried to have received more, tried to get more clarity on them. But anyway, I'll just tell you that's a different workshop, right? So the licensee's present or previous familiar, get that, social, sexual, emotional, not so sure about that. Certainly financial, I understand. Supervisory, political, I'm not so sure I understand political relationship, but anyway. Administrative, legal, or other relationships. So I also asked them, what other relationship could you possibly have? But anyway, with a client, and this is where some people aren't aware, it's the client or a person associated with or related to the client. So I don't know what that means, associated with, but anyway, related to the client we get. So anyway, and there's the specific legal citation where you can find it. So true or false, a behavioral health professional is only required to report suspected child abuse or neglect when they're working and are not required to report suspected abuse or neglect that they may discover in their volunteer or other personal activities. So we can just take a stab at what we think. False, false, yep, false. All righty. Yep. And the legal citations for that, it is false. So certain professionals, there's the assumption that we've been trained and we are able to identify it, and that's why we're required in a different section. But really, everybody is required to report suspected maltreatment. And there's just two sections. So we, as a health practitioner or a law enforcement officer, educator, or we look most frequently at Family Law 5704, but Family Law 5705 is the section that really talks about all categories of people. I don't know about you, but I'm having an awful lot of fun. But anyway, here we go. True or false? Behavioral mental health professional is able to invoke client privilege communication if a subpoena is issued to present their client's record or to provide testimony. So is true or false, can a social worker say that they're not going to provide information because it's a privilege communication? Got some falses, some depends. Attorneys hate that when you say depends. Depend. Okay, so anybody want to take a stab at the legal citation for that? So all the places in the law where talk about privileged communication, like, a spouse not being forced to testify against a spouse, that's all in courts and judicial proceedings. There's a whole list of them. Social workers can be found in Courts and Judicial Proceedings 9-121. And I have to say that NASW Maryland worked really hard to get social workers added to that list. For a long time, we were not. So they're always looking in the law, like where does someone have a privilege, or they can do something in their scope of practice, and where they can get social workers in. It's true that there is language around privileged communication, but the client has to invoke that privilege. We can't invoke it for the client. So, again, this is a different workshop, but if in that situation, you would want to just notify your client that you've received a subpoena, and then they, through their attorney, would invoke that privilege. But we don't. Okay. Describe the circumstances when a social worker may engage in physical contact with a client. So if you have a new social worker or student asking you, are there any situations where a social worker can engage in physical contact with a client? Maybe in a group activity, exercise, or maybe in a hospice setting, or, depending upon what your setting is. We've got ask them if it's okay for a hug. That's what a lot of people say. Client needs first aid, client initiates it. What I find very often is that, oh, I love it, high fives all day, that, we, you often sort of want to use common sense, right? And these are often natural responses, and common sense is a good thing. But I think that what's important is, if you have situations where you're using physical contact, it would probably be helpful in your record, or even in the sort of standard operating procedures, in some Word document somewhere, that you say that you first reviewed COMAR 1042-0306D, and and after reflecting on that piece of regulation, which is social work licensing, that's that same section. Anytime you see 10.42, that's social work licensing. That you considered the language in that regulation, and before making the decision to have that physical contact. It doesn't matter who initiates it. It doesn't matter who, if you ask. What matters is that it's for the benefit of the client. That's always our criteria. So for those of you that know me, I'm a hugger. I think it's part of just my Italian heritage. I want to hug everybody. As a CPS worker, I had to fight hugging. I just wanted to, hug the children, a lot of the parents. So, part of it is, it isn't if, a lot of times, even like at endings, when I was on ongoing and I would be ending with a client, I really wanted to hug them. But you have to be really careful. And even if a client initiates a hug, it's really important that you describe ahead of time what would be your standard practice if that were to happen. So again, that's a different workshop, but I do that it has to be. You should be aware that in our regulations, they talk about physical contact. So if you're using physical contact, you certainly want it to be in accordance with, to be aware that there are regulations that talk about it, and your practice would be in accordance with it. I do want you to know that I am seeing like your specific questions, but I want to move forward with the content, and there are specific workshops that, in a more meaningful way, really look at these questions, which I would really prefer to do than to sort of just a short kind of answer. Okay. So our last one here, so true or false, for a minor to be reported to CPS for having sexual contact with another minor, there needs to be at least 4 years difference between the alleged victim and the alleged perpetrator. So we got false, false, false. All righty. Yep, it's false. And I don't know if any of you want to take a stab at where that might be, but what sometimes happens is, in the definitions for suspected sex abuse, it says household or family member or a person with temporary care, custody, or supervision of a child. And it doesn't say anything, and that includes children. You can have a household member or a family member that is a child or a minor, right? And the victim is also a minor. And there's no piece in there that talks about age. So it doesn't matter. You could have the alleged perpetrator could actually be younger than the alleged victim. It doesn't matter. Now, what sometimes gets confusing is if you look at criminal law in Title III, so criminal law 3303, 3304. Also, if you look at the sexual offenses, first degree through fourth degree, they do talk about year difference. And so if there is a 4-year difference for some of the crimes, you can be charged there's more of a penalty if there's and there's a whole I had a police officer colleague of mine that actually made a chart for me because it's actually sort of like, if it includes vaginal intercourse and this and that, it's this charge, and it's like it gets a little more detailed. But age does matter for charging, but age does not matter for our suspicion for child abuse and neglect. All right, so I don't know about you, but this is a lot of fun. So looking at all of those areas, there are specific statutes that speak to those activities that we're involved in. And I want to thank everybody who put in a little comment. It makes me feel like I'm not alone in my room here. Okay, so the definition of policy, policy, the reason it's so exciting is it's really about action, and that's not usually what people think about things is, policy, and, students around here dread their policy course, but it's really because they think it's so dry or inactive, but it's really not. It's really all about defining a course of action. What is going to be the response? And it really does help focus around decisions. So where does policy come from? And I can't remember if in your slide all the answers are there or not. But I don't know. Anyway, I don't know if anybody wants to chime in. Where does policy come from? Laws, regulations, guidance. Yep, laws. So in the best world, we hope they come from best practice. That isn't always the case, but we do have, and I would advocate that we have more social workers in those policy. Thank you for telling me you had the answers. Anyway, that there are more social workers in areas where policy is being written at the state and federal level, because it's, there's a lot of influence and power in how things are defined, and we've seen that. So we hope that it's best practice and research rather than public opinion. Although public opinion is important, but lots of times there'll be some news event, and that's sometimes the worst policy gets written, like after some emotional, some one event occurs, and then they try to write policy that then impacts everybody when that's a very unique situation. So you hope that as you're learning policy practice issues, NASW Maryland has a legislative committee. I can't really get laws changed, but if I hear from my colleagues about a particular area, then it's helpful to get that information either to departments where there are policy people that are involved in changing laws around social work practice, or other organizations, certainly healthcare for the homeless. There's lots of organizations that are working about advancing policy. And so they're working every year and sort of identifying those issues. Sometimes court decisions and settlements from court activity can impact, they can define meaning of words that are already in law, or they can, like for the states that don't have duty to warn, describe those states are now bound by the description that's in that court case that happened in a state that wasn't their state. Administrators, leaders, I found that a lot in my years at the Department of Human Resources, or Department of Human Services. Now they changed their name, but very often there would be a new director or administrator, and they had a different direction on where things should go. We certainly see that from governors. We certainly see that at the national level. There's a lot of influence. Sometimes particular legislators may have a particular family experience, and so they become a champion in a particular area. Hopefully it's from experiences from the front lines. We hope that practice is informing policy direction. Political action, we've seen multiple times in our history where a political action warrants a policy. There are audits. I always, people know that there are financial, fiscal audits. That's usually what people think about. But there are also legislative audits. So the legislature actually looks at different state departments to see if they are implementing the law as it's supposed to be. So there are also legislative audits, and sometimes that will result in policy changes. And we talked about news events. So I got a little shout out there to my a macro practice area, and we in our practice areas, we know that we're not just working with individuals. Certainly there are we're working in a setting with other colleagues, with agencies, committees, communities, and so the laws that govern individual practice also apply to larger practice settings. And we often don't think about that, but it's important. Very often in the statutes, they don't really limit it to specific settings. Like, for example, confidentiality. The confidentiality law talks about the kind of information. It doesn't say where is that information being, housed. So you probably have the answer to this too, I'm guessing. So are you responsible for non-professional staff and volunteers? The answer to that is yes, a big yes. So one of the ways that you protect yourself, if we're going back to risk management, is that you make sure that you have some form in your agency that for confidentiality or other expectations that you have, that if someone is starting, and all of your staff, that they understand, just, the form just says you've given them a copy, you've given them a chance to identify any questions that they might have, and you've explained it, and they're just signing that you explained it. There was a lawsuit of a social worker in private practice, and the service that came in to clean the office after hours actually got together pieces from a ripped up phone message in the trash can, and then posted on Facebook information about a client who they knew. So because that social worker didn't have a form, they held the responsibility for that breach of confidentiality. Whereas if they would have had a form that said, this information is confidential, and while you're cleaning my office, you need to make sure you understand these laws, and had that form been done, it would have then placed the responsibility on the, the cleaning service. staff. So think about, you're not, I know we explain to our staff, but we're also responsible for explaining these things that are important to us, to all of the people that are involved in your office. It'd be great actually to post something too, to have, something visibly reminding people that, the information that they may hear in that setting is confidential and it's bound by Health General 4301. Okay, interpreting policy. So it's really important to know the source of the policy. So I've had a couple of questions. You probably thought I was ignoring you, but I'm not. Sort of asking or implying the differences between COMAR and statute. And so we are going to talk about that. But it's important to know, is this a law? Is this a regulation? Or is this just a memo my supervisor wrote? I like knowing the relevant case history. That's probably just because I'm a policy enthusiast / policy nerd. It helps me better understand. So like when I'm doing workshops on child abuse and neglect and the changes in the law, I like knowing the relevant case, either the case as in terms legal case or just the practice issue. What's happening in practice that is necessitating some change in language because it gives more meaning to it. So it's always helpful if someone can explain the meaning behind that policy change. In all policies, well, most policies, certainly statutes and regulations, they use an outline format. So sometimes it's hard to follow, but always look for that. They're really very often really bad run-on sentences. And so you really kind of have to find the period at the end of the sentence and look for, all the different, like a lot of times when I'm reading a new policy or a new statute I haven't seen for a while, or especially the regulations for social work licensing, I make a Word document and try to break it up in a way that I can follow it. Because if it's a really long run-on, you can lose the meaning of the sentence because there's so many clauses in it. Often in policy, they'll refer you to other policy references. So for example, if you look at social work licensing, they tell us in 104203 that we're required to report suspected maltreatment, child abuse and neglect, as well as vulnerable adults. And they refer to Family Law 5701 for child abuse. And so you can often, so they're not going to, so if the child abuse and neglect law changes, they're not going to have to update the social work licensing statute because they didn't put the specific definition. They just referred you to the other place in law where it's defined. So very often when you're reading a statute or you're reading a regulation, I like to keep a little list on the side of the laws that they're pointing me to, because I'm going to have to read them too if I want to fully understand what that policy is telling me to do. Okay, so this was one of the places where I thought might make sense to sort of check in to make sure that so far you're with me and things are going well. So, okay, so thank you. So far, so good. So I'll keep going. And again, if you have a question and I miss it, I know that Shantae will give me a heads up. So, okay. So looking at these words, so let's, just take a stab. What is the definition of host? So if I say host, what are some of the first things that come to mind for you as a definition? If somebody said, what's host mean? Person in charge, sponsor, yep. Communion at church, go Chris. Yep, that's the whole point of this activity. So host, if most of us sort of talk about a person in charge or someone facilitating some event or something like that. But, as one of our participants identified, host is often a common reference to communion. If you are in a Christian religious congregation. Host could also be if we have any computer whizzes out there, of which I'm not. The host computer is the main frame of computer. You could have, if this was a biology class and we were talking about host, the carrier of disease. We could, I had a friend of mine, actually a participant in a workshop when I was doing this, said to me that it was also the name of a company. He was served in the Vietnam War, and the packaged food that they ate, the company was Host. And so when he saw the word host, the first thing he thought about was these packaged foods. So those definitions of the word host are all correct. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is it depends on the context. So all of the definitions are correct, even radical. If I ask you what is radical, depending upon your age, the first thing I kind of think about is hippie. But, it could be political. You might think of those kind of radical, outside of the norm. The older I get and I start talking about knee surgery and different activities that I need, what are my radical, is the surgery minor or radical? If we're in a math class, it's square root or something like that. So all of what's really important to know is that any time you are reading a law or reading a regulation, you have to look at the first section on how are those words, what are the definitions. So we've already mentioned that the word child or minor has many different definitions, and so the meaning of the word if you're reading a section of law, that's the meaning of what that word means, not the meaning in some other statute. So you really need to pay attention. So usually when I'm reading a law, I want to make sure the first that like let's say I'm looking at my reporting responsibility for child abuse and neglect. I'm going to look at family law. Family law 5704. And they'll mention the words child abuse and neglect. So I first have to go to the first section, which is 5701, and I'm going to show you in a second, to really understand the meanings of those words. So the definition in the statute is what matters, not the definition in a dictionary. The words shall or may are really important. So if it says that you shall do something, it's mandated. There is no discretion. Sometimes in the law, they will say these are things that may be considered. So again, it really depends if it's telling you to do something or it is suggesting that you do something. And if it says something is or something includes. So if I, like the definition, like a lot of times, sexual abuse, sexual molestation includes but is not limited to, and then they list different behaviors, because there may be some sexual activity that is in the nature of what that statute's talking about, but they didn't specifically identify it. But if it says is, then that's the only definition of, which is whatever's provided. That's the only meaning of that word. And then the words and or. So this is where it gets a little confusing when there's like clauses of terms. So I, like a lot of times if I'm reading a statute that's important to my practice area, I go through and I look for the ors and ands and I circle them because I want to pay attention to them better. So if I said, if you could go to the store for me and buy apples, pears, or oranges, then any one of those things would be okay, right? If I, hello?
Yes. So this is Shantae again. I
Mm-hmm.
apologize for interrupting, but what we've been having an issue for people trying to get in, and the issue is that other people have shared their link with coworkers, and we have people showing up as duplicates. If you have someone sign in with your link in 10 minutes, you will be kicked out of the workshop if you are showing up twice. So you may want to call whoever, if you shared it, you may want to call them and let them know that they need to get out now because there are people that cannot get in. So just know that your name needs to only show up once. And if you shared the link, it will show up twice. Thank you.
Okay. So, where was okay? So if you just want to make sure that, so if I said go to the store and buy apples, pears, and oranges, then it would all three of would be included. What gets a little confusing sometimes, it'll say something like, if you go to the store, could you buy apples and pear or oranges? And so then it would be okay. You'd have to have apples, but you could have pears or oranges. So again, sometimes in the very sentence, and I know that all of my grammar teachers um, are probably cringing when they read any policies because they can put ands and ors in all kinds of ways. So it's really important to look for those when you're trying to read it. Okay, so here we are back to fifth grade, right? I think that was fifth grade. I kind of thought about even showing the Schoolhouse Rock. There, I think it was a three-ring circus shows the branches of government. And so I want to just do a quick, the rest of this presentation is sort of organized under these three branches because that's where we're going to find policy and get a chance to sort of search a little bit. So the three branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. So let's look at the first one, the legislative branch. So we all know that there are bills that are introduced. Our session in Maryland is 90 days. Specific legislators can introduce bills or departments can introduce bills. Sometimes different governors don't let departments introduce bills. Depending upon their, what their goals are. So it's really important to pay attention to those. And I think I really would invite all of us to be more active participants in the process. The average numbers of bills introduced each year are in the thousands, 3,000 bills. So lots of times, not many of them pass, but what's sometimes hard to think about, or that a lot of times people don't understand, that they are amending, either adding content or subtracting content from existing laws. So we're going to take a look at a bill and see, we need to be able to find out what law is it amending. And sometimes they can create a completely new law, but they're going to do that new law in the same section. So for example, if some social work law changes, they're going to put it in Title 19 because that is the section in our law that governs health, social work practice. So sometimes you may wonder why, if you've been thinking, they really need to change this law. Sometimes departments or legislators are reluctant to go forward with a bill because they know that the climate of their committee may be the opposite of what that bill might be trying to do. So once a bill is introduced, the statute then becomes vulnerable for any changes. So you might think you'll be making something better by maybe expanding eligibility for a particular population, but it might actually be worse. So that's why sometimes a decision is made not to introduce a bill. And the bills that sometimes we don't pay attention to, which are really important, is the budget bill. It's hard to get people excited about that, but that's really important. The governor submits their budget, and only the legislative branch can make cuts. So it's really important that we advocate for services before the budget, because the legislative legislature really is limited, and they can't really add money in particular budget areas. So these next couple of slides are showing you the places to find statutes, and then I'm actually gonna go through slides, and then I'm gonna do a live search of that, because I think it's important for us to kind of know, and I'm gonna pull up the social work bill that passed actually the session before, but went in effect just this past July as a live example. But let's just take a look. The Maryland General Assembly is the place where you can find legislation by session, which would be bills. And then you can also find, if you are paying attention to my arrow, my cursive here, also statutes. But right now we're going to focus on bills. I don't know if any of you are from DC, but I did include that site, and as well as Virginia. I don't know where you all are, but I'm happy to, probably later on, if you have questions on those other sites. I'm really just going to demonstrate the Maryland. They're all pretty much the same, but just in the interest of time. So what I'm going to show is there were some changes in 2017 to the definition of child sexual abuse. It added two different bills, actually. One bill added a different category of people, so a person who has authority, a position of authority over a child, and they also beefed up the definitions around sexual trafficking. So now it doesn't matter the relationship of the person who is any individual involved in sexual trafficking would meet the definition of child sex abuse. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail about the actual bill. That's a different workshop, but I just wanted to use that as a demo because that might be an area that you want to look at. So the first thing you'll do is pull up the Maryland General Assembly, and I always forget the site. I put the site up there for you. So you can just type in Maryland General Assembly. I'm going to do this a little fast because soon I'm going to do a live search, and we'll go a little slower, but I just thought I would just try this out. So you'd click the legislation by session, and then you would go to it passed in 2017, not 2018. So you'd want to add that, click add in. If you notice down here, where I'm circling on the kind of the middle left-hand side, you can change the session. So you'd put the session, and then you put in the bill number. You can also search by topics if nobody gave you the bill number. Then you're going to click over there, and it's going to pop up on the bill kind of description page. So you have a little summary, has the fiscal note and different information about it. Lots of times people, they'll find this page and think, I can't find the bill. Well, it's on the left-hand side. So usually if it's during the session, it won't have this chapter number here. This is just the bill passed, and so you can find the bill as passed, written in the actual statute. But I just wanted to show you that you just go to the left-hand side, and we'll do a live thing on that in a moment, and you click on there and the bill will pop up. So here, as I mentioned before, bills change laws. They either add language or take language out. So the place that you can find it is right in the bill. If you see where my yellow arrow is pointing, it shows you by adding to Family Law 5701X. That's the definition that they're adding to. And then you can read. All this here, at the bottom of each page, it will explain to you what the what the meaning of the different fonts will mean. So here we notice that this is all capital. That means new language going in. And then we'll see here there's a bracket and a bracket here. That's language coming out. And here you'll see also where it tells you where they're adding in the law. And then any number here on the left-hand side, that's the specific sections of the law it's changing. Sometimes one bill will change multiple laws. And so you can just look on the left-hand side. If you run down this column, anytime there's a number, it'll let you know that the next law is being added in that bill. Okay. So one thing I want to mention is that lots of times, people will say, they'll reference bills that pass by their bill number for many, many, many years. And there are still people in child welfare talking about Senate Bill 512. And every year there is a Senate Bill 512. And so it's helpful, like the year after a bill passes, to know the bill number, but to keep referencing a change in law by the bill number really doesn't make any sense, because you'll notice, every year this number, Senate Bill 512, has meant all kinds of things. Once it meant motor oil for farm use. So it changes the meaning, especially when there are things that are closer to the original bill. So this bill, Senate Bill 512 in 1997 changed Family Law Article 5706. So it changes the law. So that doesn't exist anymore. It's just the law change. Okay, so there we go. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to actually do a live search, and the bill that I selected was the social work licensing bill, and I cannot believe that I let my spell check change session to lesion. So many apologies for that slide. I could pretend that I put that in for some comic relief, but I didn't, so sorry about that. So here we go. So here I am live on the Maryland General Assembly page. So I'm going to go by legislation by session. And I'm going to change the session because this law, although it went in effect July, it was passed in 2017. And the bill that I'm going to put in is Senate Bill 986. You can tell I've searched that a few times because it popped up. Okay. Please let me know if I'm going too fast. Then you'll notice that this law did pass, so you can find the law as passed. If I look down here, I can see Senator Nathan Pulliam. I want to put a shout out to her. She's been a very strong advocate for social work and our social work, not just licensing, but in terms of issues that are important to us. She often is a sponsor of bills, works, NASW through its membership, often kind of proposes ideas to her, and she's been a very strong advocate and very receptive. Here it says cross-file. That just means that there was also a House bill introduced, and if you go to the House bill, you can click on there. Delegate West, also he's a Baltimore County delegate, has also been very supportive of licensing and social work issues. And then if you go to, if the bill already passed and it has a chapter version, that's going to be the better version to go to. So there we go. And you'll notice that there were some amendments that were even in the description. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit. And here it tells me the law that it's changing, Health Occupations Title 19, Section 19, that's us, right? So we know social work is Health Occupations 19. So anytime they're changing that, they're changing social work law. And as I mentioned, the first section here, this is, again, this would be, if I was referencing this law, I would say Health Occupations 19-101. And the first section are definitions. This is like 42 pages, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But I just wanted to show you that the definitions is in the first section. Some of the things that were proposed were crossed out, meaning the committee or amendments were made that didn't accept it. I don't want to go into too much detail, but there are some areas of interest that if you are interested in looking at the draft regulations that are enforcing this or being involved in any way or even have questions, NASW Maryland has been really helpful. Daphne McCullen is going around the state sort of explaining, these 42 pages of changes to the statute. It's complicated, so I don't want to go too far deep in it for this purpose, but I did want to just show you what it would, what it would look like to go through. And if you wanted to, you can make a copy of the bill, if that was, if for some reason you wanted that. Okay. And if you X out of the thing that you would copy, you'll get back to the search, the original search page that you were in. You could put another bill in if you want. You could go back to the home and, it might be a different session that you want to search a bill for. Okay, I'm feeling like you got that part, so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint, unless you tell me sorry about that. Okay. So any questions on bills? We're going to move on to statutes. Just a reminder that we're not going to be taking a break until 12:15. So let's hopefully hang in there. So anyway, I'm going to keep going, but where are we in the handouts? Okay, so we have left bills and we are moving to statutes. We're still in the legislative branch. So if you're looking at the three branches of government, we're going to look at legislative, executive, and judicial, but we're still in the, oh, thank you. Somebody said page 9. So now that we're sort of leaving bills and we're going to be moving on to law, there are different forms of state laws. There's criminal law and civil law. Short answer to that, other than being a law class, is criminal law, there's some penalty. So the purpose of criminal law is to control behavior by having a punishment. And then civil law is really where we find more of the laws around protection. So child abuse and neglect, vulnerable adults, those things are under civil law, where, where in the law does there need to be, are there vulnerable populations that need attention or response. So again, in civil law, there may be a child reported that a 4-year-old with gonorrhea, and we're not getting information from the child on who did it. So there's nobody to arrest, nobody to charge, or to prosecute. Still, CPS would be involved in providing protection for that child under the civil law, even if there's no one to penalize, or convict for that crime. Later on, I'm going to talk about annotations. That's just a fancy word for footnotes. So we'll be able to look for copies for laws, but we're going to get the copies of laws that are free. We don't want to pay Nexus Lexis for the footnotes. If we were attorneys, the footnotes would be, the annotations would be really important. Once a year, I do go to the law library and pull up the laws if I'm going to train on particular laws, because I want to know the case laws, the examples that might illustrate a point. But most of the time, I'm not looking up the annotations. I just need to know what's the law telling me to do. I'm going to show you some slides that have different laws, just so you can see the structure of what it looks like. Here's an example here. Family, usually they just put the initials, FL, but you could spell out family law if you wanted to. This is the section. If you're looking, if you want to type something and you can't find that, it's an insert. If you're in Word, it's insert symbols. For me, that's the first symbol that pops up because I use it a lot, but it's pretty easy to find. And then 5701, and we're going to take a look at where you actually find that. And the place that you're going to want to find Maryland statute is, we're going to go back to the General Assembly page, and I'm going to show you that in a second. But I just wanted to show you some other, this is ethics workshop, so I want to keep coming back to this whole ethics foundation. Our relevant statutes pertaining to professionals around our ethics, as I said before, we're Title 19, so it's health occupations, HO. You'll notice there are other professionals that are in health occupations, and there are differences in terms of, so if I ask, how many years do we have to wait before we can have sex with a client? If you looked under Title 19, the answer is never, right? If you look for professional counselors or therapists, psychologists, is different. I think it's 3 years now. I know there was an amendment to make it 2 years, but I have to look that back up. But anyway, it's less time than we have as a professional. So those specific laws they're relevant to the particular individual. We've had students before in field placements that are multi-professional that get a little confused, because if they're working with other colleagues in that agency, they might have a question, and a professional counselor or therapist is going to answer that depending upon what is that scope of practice, which is often might be a different answer excuse me, for us in social work. I'm just going to take a sip of tea. Okay. I also wanted to show you, this is just a list of some other laws, and when we're done, we're going to search some of these, but you're going to be able to find them on your own. I'm completely confident. My purpose of this is to show you, man, there's some funky looking laws here, we got a family law 5706.3. What is that all about? And here 54B.0, -06. The structure is similar, right? We can see that the names of the articles of law are topics. So families, health occupations, health general, human services, these are topics. You'll notice later on when we look at regulations, they're not going to be topics. They're going to be state departments. So, we look under the titles of the laws, and the reason that you'll see something, and we're going to look this up actually, because this is kind of an odd thing to see the point something, is all this means is when laws change, they want you to be able to find them. And so when they changed, or they added language around drug exposed newborns, what's going to be the response? What's CPS going to do when there's a drug exposed newborn? And they know that we know, if we want to know what is CPS going to do in response to a report, we would go to 5706. So they shoved this little subset of what CPS going to do for drug-exposed newborns. They wanted to put it close to 706 because that's where we're going to look for what intervention is CPS going to do. So what they do is they shove it in close to where we're going to be looking for it. And this will make more sense when we actually look for some stuff. So this next slide is actually a handout as well, where I put a little bit on the side, sort of what are the steps, and I'm going to show you those steps right now, but we're going to just walk through them a little bit. Okay, so we've been on this page before. We went to the Maryland General Assembly page because we were looking up bills, and we went to legislation by session, which is over here, to the left a little bit. Now we're going to search by statutes, and again, if you're looking through Virginia or DC's page, it's going to be statute. Some states I've noticed they say law and statutes because most of the time we refer to laws as laws. We don't call them statutes usually, but that's okay. Now you know that statute just means law. And what you'll do once you click on statutes, you're going to come down to the very far left-hand side of this page, and you're going to click on LexisNexis. But I want to talk about that a little bit. So LexisNexis unannotated code. Someone asked a question, what page is the slide on? It was a handout, the one that had the description of the different steps, step 1, step 2, and I have another instructional, it had the regs also on that page. If you don't have that handout, we'll make sure you get it. But anyway, okay. So LexisNexis, what you have to promise me you're going to do, and I have no way of checking, but you'll know if you break your promise to me, that you'll never put in any search box LexisNexis. Because if you do that, you're going to be pushed to the page that asks for your credit card. Because LexisNexis is a company and they provide copies of, they are the place where we can find our laws. And it has to be one place. We can't have different places having conflicting information, right? There has to be one place where we know the law is up to date. And so that's a pretty good contract to have. So the part of it is they must provide copies that are free to anybody, but that's no way to run a business. So the unannotated code means no footnotes, no case laws, no details. It's just the law, unannotated code. If you're an attorney, you have to have the version that has the case law because that's important for your work. So that's how they maintain their business, is attorneys will subscribe, or other organizations actually will subscribe to the annotated version of LexisNexis. But for our purposes, we don't need the footnotes. We just need to know what is the law. And the purpose of the state, there's an interest in the state. They want us to always know what the law is. So, for example, when I received my driver's license in high school, there were not phones that did text messaging. So if I'm pulled over by a police officer and I'm using my text, I'm texting somebody on the phone, and I say, oh, well, officer, when I received my license, my driver's ed teacher never told me I can't text and drive. Well, that's no argument. The state makes sure that I have free access to all laws. So I can't say, oh, I didn't know that. That's, by being public like that, it's our responsibility to know what those laws are. So, okay. So you click on Maryland General Assembly, go to statutes, and you hit LexisNexis. Now you're probably thinking, why do I have to go through all that steps? Because in this workshop in the beginning, she gave me all the sites for these different laws, and I'm really interested in that emergency petition thing she talked about in Health General 10-622. I'm going to go put that in my in a text box and search it. You got to promise me you're not going to do that either, because if you put in a citation of a law in like a general, search text, text box, you're going to get old copies, probably of a lot of my handouts, of laws. So it's really important that you take the extra step to search laws through the General Assembly page, through this link to LexisNexis, because you'll get the most current law. And it's sometimes hard to keep track of handouts. So a lot of times in my handouts, I might give you the answer, on a slide, but I always have the reference in the law, if there is one to give, because then you can always keep up to date as changes happen. Okay, so once you click on LexisNexis, it'll take you to this page, and you agree, it's free access, it's not legal advice, you're not going to sell it, yada, yada, yada. Okay, I agree. And I'm going to show you this search as we later in a moment, live. And so you'll notice that the options, once you agree to, not do any of those things, that you will have topics, agriculture, alcoholic beverages, families, health general, they're topics. So again, laws want you to find them. It wasn't always the case in Maryland. These used to be numbers. So the confidentiality law used to be Article 88, and they rechanged them. So it's a good thing. Okay, so for the purpose of this, I'm just going to search through family law. But when we get to the actual live search, I'm going to pick, we mentioned a lot about the health general, 4301, 430, when those questions that we answered in the beginning, that's the confidentiality law. So that's what I'm going to pull up for us when I do the live search. But let's just take a look. So I'm going to look at family law, because I mentioned that the child abuse and neglect law changed last couple of years, the definitions. So you find family law, and then, and I'm sorry, I went too quick. Over here, you'll see these plus signs. So if I were to click on this family law plus sign, it would open up. See, it's now a little negative sign. It opened up this family law for me. And you'll notice down here, they have adult protective services, child support, alimony, custody, divorce, things that you would think, if you were in the room, I might ask you, what do you think you'd find under family law? So things pertaining to the family, right? So if we were wondering, if I'm looking for the definition of child abuse and neglect, and you're looking at this list, like if you didn't know where the law, the citation of the law was, you probably would click children. You might click one, you wouldn't find it there, but you're not going to look at divorce, you're not going to look at alimony. There's really places that you wouldn't look. So anyway, if you click on 5, that plus sign, you see how it now is a negative sign, and it opened up all of Title 5, which is children. Now again, I'm looking for the definition of child abuse and neglect. So I would just look through the list. Well, again, a lot of people think it's under definitions. And again, you'd go there and it wouldn't be there, but you see they got adoption and interstate compact, mutual involuntary, child foster care, so you'll see a bunch of stuff. And subtitle 7 says child abuse and neglect, so that looks like a good idea. But you'll also notice that subtitle 9 says child abuse. It's not a big deal, because if you were to click subtitle 9, you would see that that section was eliminated. Actually, like in the early 80s, they combined child abuse and neglect together. No big deal. You'd open it up, you wouldn't find anything, then you go back to child abuse and neglect. And if you see again, when you click on the plus sign for child abuse and neglect, it opens up all of the laws underneath of it. Now, these little page things here, you see there's no plus or negative anymore. It's a little page. And you'll notice the font is different and it's blue instead of black caps. That's the actual laws. And you can click on them. So do you see here when I talked about drug-exposed newborns, and I said they shoved in Family Law 5706.3, which is right here. They shoved it in the section around 706 because that's investigation. That term we mentioned before, substantial risk of sex abuse, there it is, Family Law 5706.2. They're sticking in that section under investigation those things related to investigation. So they're all in, one place. So if we're looking for the definition for child abuse and neglect, I would then click on this blue and it would open up, and there we go. They've done some changes to the LexisNexis, which I think are phenomenal, and I'm going to show you live when we go there. But I wanted to point out a couple of things. It's really easy to go to the next sections. So if you're looking at Family Law 5701, it's really easy to go to 2. If you, on this left-hand side, if you open up table of contents, you can navigate through Title V really easy. Excuse me. So that's another thing we're going to kind of look at. Well, let's say you can't find in your insert, you want to copy the citation. You don't have to type it anymore. If you click on copy citation, it'll let you cut and paste it into any document that you're working on if you wanted to insert it. Okay, and again, here I just wanted to illustrate that they just might look a little different in the, and this is, I'm just repeating that same slide before so that we get a little more comfortable looking at slides. Okay, so I'm going to go now to search. So here I am back at the Maryland General Assembly page, and I'm going to go to statutes. And I'm going to go down to the page. You see LexisNexis on. Okay, my clock tells me that we're scheduled for a break. So, but let me just finish this one demo, and then we'll have a 15-minute break from whenever I finish. Okay, so we're doing good. So, unannotated code of Maryland. And since I mentioned the confidentiality law a lot, I'm going to go to Health General. Oh, first I have to agree. I'm not going to sell it, all that baloney. Okay. So here I am. I'm going to go to Health General because a lot of the confidentiality things we talked about in our 14 questions were that. Health General. Now again, if I didn't give you the site, specifically, because I said it was in Title IV, right? Health General 4-301. But if I didn't do that, you would just spend a little time. Well, it wouldn't be under poison. It wouldn't be under disease or laboratory. You could eliminate where it might be. But anyway, we're going to go to statistics and records because we're looking at what is the confidentiality of mental, behavioral health records. Okay, so there we go. Confidentiality of medical records, because there's not research. We're looking at our records, and you'll notice that I mentioned before the Health General 4301 et sec. So what that means is I mean all of this. I mean 4301, 4302. If I say 4301 et sec, I mean all of it, okay? So let's just, you'll notice it changes color. We'll open that up. And there we go. All of our, this is where it tells us what is a medical record, what it includes, that, a mental health record is a considered a medical record? Again, so we can, I don't want to go through a lot of the detail. The goal of today is for you to be able to find different sections. So I mentioned in one of the sites about, who's bound by the confidentiality law, and I mentioned Health General 4302. Well, if I want to go there, I can just click next. I love that they changed this. And this talks about redisclosure, which is right here, D, which talks about how can you redisclose confidential information. And it's going to open up table of contents to show you what that looks like. So again, that's like, say, we mentioned 4301, and you wanted to go down to what is an informed consent, or what is a personal note, which is here. Then you could, if you have the table of contents version open, you can just go through there. And then you can also copy it from here. Okay, so I think we're good. So I'm feeling good about your ability. Now let's just say you want to go now to the family law article. I hope I didn't do that too quick. But anyway, at the top, it's Maryland Code and Court Rules. Anytime you click on that, that'll stay at the top of your page. Then it brings you back to that major search thing. And real quick, and then we'll take our break, health occupations. We've been talking about social work, right? So health occupations, we got nurses, morticians, optometrists, physical therapists. Right, here we are, Title 19. And then this talks about our, whatever we can go into looking at provisions around licensing. Anytime you open up those one sections, you'll get these little, these different search links that you can go straight to the statute. All right, well, I'm feeling really good about your ability here. So this is a great place for us to kind of pause. I'm wondering if, well, how about if we take our 15-minute break? So I'll set my clock, my alarm on my phone to 15 minutes. And then when we come back, if you have any questions on what we've done so far, I'll start with those. So I've got 12:19, so whatever 15 minutes is past that, I'll see you again. Have a good break. Okay, so I was looking to see if anybody had any questions on, we're leaving the legislative branch, so we've just reviewed bills and searching statutes. So I'm hoping that people feel like I can move on. So I'm going to go to the next branch of government, but if you, again, have any questions, I'm happy to. There we go. Okay, so we're leaving the legislative branch and moving to the executive branch. And very often when we think of the executive branch, we think of just the governor or lieutenant governor, but the executive branch are also all those state agencies that are responsible for implementing any laws that the legislative branch develops. So sometimes people ask questions like, what's the difference between statute and regulation? And very often they will speak on the same topic, but statute or law is really what should be done. And the executive branch, through regulations or policy, is how is it going to be done? So again, legislative branch would say when there is suspected child abuse, and they define it, that CPS should do an investigation and provide services. And they have to respond within 24 hours, right? So that's what the law says. Now, the executive branch, through regulations, through administration, through, hiring and, all those things and training, are they're implementing how is CPS going to respond when they receive calls. Okay, so the executive branch, you can have executive orders. One of the orders that sometimes is still referred to as that original one around substance abuse policy. But there can be all kind of executive orders from the governor. This process we're talking about, there's a parallel process on the federal level. So we're hearing a lot in the news around, maybe statutes aren't changing, but the presidential executive orders are changing. So again, no laws changed on how we were responding to undocumented immigrants, but lots of policy changes were made through executive orders. And so actually, we have had some examples around, the use of executive orders. Now, what's important is you still have your judicial branch to say, wait a minute, that went too far, because the executive branch, while they can do executive orders, it has to be within the intention of the law. They can't write law in executive orders. It's just, how are you going to implement existing law? Certainly through the state budget, that's one of the ways that we, again, identify as a community what's important to us by what we fund. So you can have a law, but if there's no money to actually implement it in a meaningful way, it really doesn't have a lot of impact. So that's another thing that advocates check to make sure that things are budgeted in a way that, when victories are won in policy, we want to make sure that the budget is there to support it. Certainly, the executive branch has the veto power. Usually, governors are very delicate. It's has some political cost to it. If the legislature goes through all that trouble to pass a law, and then they veto it, and again, their ability with a majority to override the veto. So a lot of times you don't want to get into that. But it certainly is available as a power of the executive branch. But a lot of the implementation, or a lot of the how the policy is actually going to be carried out, how these statutes are going to be carried out, is usually through regulations or some policy interpretation. Like you could have a question, writing a question to the Board of Social Work Examiners about the meaning of a word that they put in the statute or in the regs. And if they send you a memo back or an email back, that's their interpretation of the legal definition. There's lots of ways that an executive branch can have influence on the meaning of policy. Sometimes you can also find local departments or local, jurisdictions can have executive orders or policies. Really, an organization can decide that they're going to have dress codes and all kinds of policy that will focus on how the work is going to be done. But we're really going to stick at the sort of executive branch level. So COMAR, which is the Code of Maryland Regulations. So we want to, agencies, administrative agencies have the responsibility and authority to amend their regulations. Sometimes, if you're paying attention to the Board of Social Work Examiners, they frequently change their regulations on their own without any law change. They just, again, see the changes in practice, or maybe questions that they've gotten they want to clarify, or after particular hearings, trends in violations, they might want to clarify something. So an agency has the authority to put regulations anytime they think they're needed. There's a process for it. So when they adopt draft regulations, they then have to go to public comment. And so we're going to talk about that in a second. What's sometimes confusing is that there may be different policies, it could be a law and a regulation or some other policy that address the same topic. And usually the rule of thumb is that each level just tries to get more specific. So you could have a law that says, a response, as I mentioned before, that when there's a suspicion of child abuse and neglect, there's a response. Regulation can get into more detail about if the child lives in one county and the abuse occurred somewhere else, kind of what the policy is going to be. And then an agency might have a policy that talks about how a state car can be used when transporting children, right? So they're all related to the response, but more providing more detail kind of as you go along, usually. So, and we're gonna look at this as well. Going with the model that I kind of set up is we're gonna talk about I'm gonna have the slides where we sort of do a search, and then I'm gonna actually do one. We're gonna search through COMAR online. There's a variety of ways to get to it. In the one handout I provided, there's a more direct link, but I wanted to start off here with the Maryland Register. So, for example, I know that the social work law passed. It went in effect July 1. And in that law, it mandates that the Board of Social Work Examiners has to come up with new regulations. And so and every 2 weeks, they're published in draft form, and you only have 30 days to comment. So every 2 weeks, I'm checking this orange arrow up here, the Maryland Register, to see if those regulations have been published. They haven't, to see if they're published yet, because then we have 30 days to comment on them. And what happens, if you look about this is also the page, if you look down here, you can find the governor's executive orders if you want. The other thing that is to think about is that these branches of government, we want to make sure that they equalize power. That's the main reason we set it up this way. So when the agency comes up with draft regulations, these draft regulations go to a committee in the legislative branch. It's called AELR, not a big deal, the name, but it goes to this legislative branch, and they make sure the state agency hasn't gone beyond the intention of the statute, that they've stayed within their authority given to them by the law. They want to make sure that agencies aren't trying to legislate through regulations. And then the comments that people make are also reviewed by this legislative branch committee. So it's really important if you have, when our regulations are out there for comment, that we look at them, and the board always sends an email to us letting us know that they have drafted regs and that they're for comment. But a lot of times people don't realize there's, when they're out for comment, there is time for advocacy and for clarification to make changes. So again, I'm going to show you, this is on that one handout that has the how to search, and I also have a little description on how to do it, but I'm going to show you live. I normally encourage people to go by option 3, the table of content structure, because very often we know what title to go to, but you might not know exactly what regulation. And so it's just an easier way to sort of search for things. This is the site that I gave you to enter, and you'll notice down here it also links you to the Maryland Register. So there's multiple ways to find all of these. Another one over here, there's multiple ways to get to the sites we've been talking about. So regulations are, you might remember that when I talked about statutes, I said that the statutes were organized by topic. So family law, agriculture, criminal law. They were it was easy to kind of go through that list and say, I have a question about health in general, or health this particular, it's related to licensing, so I'll look under health occupations. The regulations are not organized that same way. They correspond to the state agency or department in government that is responsible for implementing the regulation. So again, laws are passed through the legislative branch and they're implemented, carried out through the state agencies. So as a social worker, most of the places that I search around, honestly, are Title 07, which 07 is the Department of Human Services. Also, 13A is like elementary and high school. And then you also have 13B, which is higher education. So I search that a little more than I used to now that I'm here at the school. Department of Health, Title 10. I go there a lot because that's where licensing is. That's where confidentiality of medical, including mental health records is. Not so much anymore for me, Department of Juvenile Services, but that's in Title 16. And when I open it up as a table of contents, you'll be able to see a drop down with all these departments. So you know those departments that you are most involved in. So if you're working with children and want to know what is an excused absence, or or that information would be under education. So anyway. So again, that little example that we did about host and radical, words matter in COMAR in regulations too. So usually in regulations, the first section is definitions, and that definition is for that specific chapter. So again, you can have multiple definitions, for example, of the word child or minor. Sometimes they can expand the statute definition, but again, from the review process, they're going to make sure that they don't go too far in that. Same as laws, very often when you're looking at a regulation, they will refer you to another regulation. So if you're looking at our licensing regs in Chapter 10, you'll notice 104201, and I'll show you all the different sections of that. When you're looking at those, you'll notice that they often refer sometimes to different laws and different regulations in different chapters, or so our licensing regulations may refer to adult protective services regulations or statute, and then they could also refer to a section in their own title. So the licensing section on the penalties, for acts that we do that are punishable, and they've increased the fines to $50,000 effective July 1. So in the penalty section, which is 104209, they refer back to earlier sections of their own regulation, their own chapter. So again, you want to make sure that to fully understand what a sentence means, if they're referring back, you've got to then go look at what that meaning is, what that section is. Usually, if someone asks me for a regulation, like I'm looking for something, I usually give it at this level. The regulations look different than statutes, don't they? So they are 3 pairs of numbers separated by periods. Now, again, education has 13A and 13B, but usually they're pairs of numbers that will identify. So if I'm giving you a regulation, if you ask me, I'm going to probably say something like 09, 0.12, 0.01, 0.02. And that's really what the regulation is. I gotta say that most of the time when people are referring to regulations, they don't give it down to that level. What's really important, you at least gotta give somebody 6 numbers. Because to say 09 means nothing, like a lot of times people will say Comar 10. Well, Comar 10 is, the Department of Health. There's a lot of stuff in 10. So you're not really giving any, there's not enough detail if you just give the first 2 numbers. And a lot of times what I've noticed is somebody just gives this last set of double numbers, and that's not really helpful either, because you don't know, is it Title I or you really need to give at least 3 pairs of numbers for someone to really know. And again, the more specific, like some of the things we talked about in those first 14 questions, I gave it down to this level, where that's really the paragraph that exactly answers whatever that question is. Okay, I wanted to show you, for us as social workers, this is our, the title is 10, our subtitle is 42, Board of Social Work Examiners. And then again, this last number tells you the section of the specific regulation. Technically, there'd be another number after that that would tell you the specific regulation, but I'm going to show you later on when we just search. We're definitely going to look at this subtitle. What I wanted to also mention is that I said that our law passed in the 2017, and it went in effect July 1, and there are they're really draft regulations. Nothing has been published yet in the Maryland Register. They say they're still working on them. And when they are published, they'll be open for comments. But if you were interested, you could now go to the website, the Board of Social Work Examiners, and if you look under their meetings, on the back, if you pull up the agenda for the March 9th meeting, I think it's like 42 pages or 35 pages of draft regs will are right behind the agenda. I know they're a little hard to find, but they're not really technically draft regs yet because they haven't published them, but they're really large. I mean, it's a lot of content, and if you want to get a heads up on looking at them, you might want to do that, and then so you're ready if in fact you want to make any comments. So these are the 4 sections that they are amending: the 104201, 104202, 104208, and 104209. And this is the supervision for the purpose of licensure. And there's a pretty decent amount of changes that I think are really important. And the one area, and NASW Maryland has like a little, if you get their updates, they have a little update on the specific areas of changes that they're making, but they're changing the amount of supervision that you have to provide for licensees. They've changed, of course, now we're the LMSW instead of LGSW. They have teletherapy, I'm sorry, defined what that is and what it isn't. So if you're doing teletherapy, I would really encourage you to take a look at 104202. We need you to see if what their changes are, what implications they may have to practice, and what suggestions you might have. So on that handout that I provided, I gave you the little steps in a little box on the side for how to find a statute, and this is the little box on how to find regulation. Okay. So when you access by table of contents, which would be my advice, you then will come to this page where you can select your regulation. And if you go on the little drop down box, you'll notice these are all state departments, as I said before. And I just picked Department of Human Services just to sort of as a one demonstration. The first number tells you the department. The second number tells you the administration, so 0702. And then it just lists all of the regulations underneath. So if you're going to 070202, I'm sorry, 070201, these are all of the services that fall under Social Services Administration. So again, if you're looking for maybe Child Protective Services or the substance abuse, substance exposed newborn, whatever, then you can just go to that specific site. Adult services are also there. And then when you click on that specific site, you'll come to this page, and it's sort of, again, it's table of contents. It's sort of asking you, okay, what do you want? And do you want purpose and scope, definitions, eligibility? So what they give you on this page is a little, the first couple sentences. So then you get to decide, oh yeah, that's what I'm looking for. And it's just a way, rather than just listing 0702, 0701, they give you a little description so you know if that's what you're looking for. And then when you click on the blue highlighted links, it'll take you straight to that regulation. I think this is why people just say .02. This regulation here is actually 0702, 0702. But I think when people copy them out and they just see the .02, that's what they're referencing. I don't know, that's my guess. I'm sticking to it. So this, again, I'm just trying to show you the different, most of the time it's going to be pairs of letters divided by periods is the look of it. And the first number is going to tell you the State Department that's in charge of it, okay? Health, education, juvenile services. Okay, so let's take a look. So now I'm going to go to my live search, okay? And I'm here at the Division of State Documents. If you put in my link, this is what it'll take you. And I suggested that you go to the option 3, which is Table of Content Structure. And here's that drop down. So I'm going to pick the Department of Health because some of the, when we did those questions in the beginning, I mentioned physical contact and boundaries, dual relationships. So that's what I thought that might be helpful to look at that in more detail. So I'm going to pick, I just select Department of Health. Oh my goodness. That has never happened. So let's try this again. Pew. Okay. Alrighty, not sure what I did wrong, but usually when you click on there. So now I'm in the Department of Health. My first two numbers would be 10, right? So I'm going to be looking, okay, now if I'm interested in social work stuff, now again, I happen to know, and I know you all know now, 1042. 42 is the Board of Social Work Examiners. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to be looking for is always going to be 1042 because we're social workers. Okay. So here, this is what I had a little a screenshot earlier that showed you the different sections that we have in our regs. So I mentioned a couple. This is a although they've already amended this section. This is not one that they're reviewing or amending, but it I guess this was about 6 years ago they amended this, and I think it's important to take a look at because there's a lot of stuff in here that very often, around boundaries and so lots of what we consider ethics falls under 1042.03. So it's actually called Code of Ethics. So again, if you're wondering, again, I gave you some sites, but you might be, just taking a look, oh, well, the definitions, what is impairment, what is client, dual relation, you might go through there, and they kind of have it organized by, responsibilities to clients, responsibility to colleagues. And then this is the section too, they talk about relationships. So there's some stuff in there about um, um, dual relationships as well. So, okay, we talked about this. So there's a lot in this section 1042.03.06 around practice. And again, I don't like that title too much because it doesn't really tell you what to do. But I mean, it's less descriptive, this standards of practice. But I had mentioned earlier, there's a lot of stuff in '06. So we had talked about, where is it? Okay, here it is, B. So I'm now in, if you ever lose your place, just go to the top, 1042.03.06B. And this is the section that when I was giving the answer about dual relationships, right? And a licensee, present or previous, familiar. So this is where we get all that. And I also mentioned the section around physical contact, right? Physical contact. So again, it's 1042.03.06D. And then you get into that language, okay? And again, you can go, I just went to that left-hand arrow. So I might want to look at, because the definition section is really important. And then I have my, I might want to go back and forth between definitions and the actual section of the regulations. And I can just use this arrow up here to the left to go back and forth. All righty. So let me, there we go. Okay. So any questions on finding regulations? Okay. All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep going, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. So again, sometimes they can write policies as an agency. Lots of times you'll find these on websites. One of the places I get a lot of questions about are child protective services or adult protective services. Because we're mentioned, and and a lot of our work is involved in that. And so you can find under the Department of Human Resources, they have their policies that are available. Now, they're actually under Business Center, which is sometimes kind of odd, but might not think to go there. But if you go under Business Center, you can actually go under Documents, and you'll find copies of their internal policies. And you can find them by topic that are also very helpful. And other agencies as well. So again, here under SSA policy directives, they're more relevant if you're actually working in that field, but I found it's also helpful for me as a practitioner in the area to look at, also like policies around adult protective services. It just gives me more meaning, more understanding about what the role of these agencies are. And again, when you click on policy directives, child welfare, they just have like a running list of all their different policies. If you're looking for a particular one, you could ask someone in the field to help you narrow in, but they're just in chronological order. I do work in the area, I teach students in the area of child welfare, so I do try to keep track of more policy directives that are important for practice. And so I often, because there is no like topic directory, they're just chronological. So, you can also find people within the field that might be helpful. So I'm just having so much fun here. I realize what time it is. So I'm not going to go through the search for the SSA policy directives. But if any of you are interested in that and can't follow the slides, then please let me know. Just want to make sure I get all my pieces here. So judicial branch, you know, we have less of a direct impact in a way because the judicial branch interprets the law and the application of it. So court decisions can certainly influence the activity. So, sometimes courts only really impact one particular case, and they don't have an impact on the meaning of laws in general, and sometimes they do. Sometimes civil actions or lawsuits for those child welfare workers in the city, in Baltimore City, they have more requirements in their service than other counties because they're under a lawsuit, LJ versus Masinga. So sometimes certain civil actions can explain differences between responses within the state. And Attorney General opinions are really important. If there were any that apply to your work, you'd know about them because, anyway. So the opinions of the Attorney General you can find on their website. This is just my telling me I got 5 more minutes, and we're all good. I don't have too many slides left. So you can look up an opinion. The most, like there's the opinion about when an adult discloses that they were maltreated as a child. I've heard that most frequently of sort of like an opinion that we might be interested in. But you're certainly, there are other opinions that would have impact. And only a legislator or a state agency can ask for an official opinion of the Attorney General. It's sort of, that's like asking the kind of Supreme Court, like what is the interpretation? It's a big deal to ask the Attorney General for an official opinion. So what do? If a law changes and goes in effect October 1, but the regulations don't get written and promulgated until October 2019, when do you change? The answer to that is the law changes October 1, then 2018, you change October 1, 2018. So again, we are feeling this right now that the licensing regulations haven't been written yet. Well, that's okay because the law went in effect July 1. So if you have a LG, you're now to put LMSW. Even though the regs haven't been promulgated, the law's pretty clear. So those things have to be implemented. The same thing if there are regulations that are modified and there's old policy. Regulations sort of trump old policy in terms of authority. And so that would be what you would follow for interpretation. And bottom line, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not an attorney. I'm hoping that this conversation you feel more empowered and competent in identifying laws, and that then you can go to your supervisor or attorney when seeking advice, and you'd have specific language like, in our setting, do we have personal notes? And, sometimes I think it's helpful just to know the laws that impact our practice so that when we're getting advice, it's more meaningful for us. All righty, so any loose ends that people, either anything I identified or that you might have missed, or if I went too fast, you would change when the statute changes. So somebody had a question. So if the law goes in effect October 2018, you change the law. So our law changed about the social work licensing changed July 1, 2018. So we changed already July 1st. Someone is bringing up questions about guns and mental illness. I really stuck more to actual statute. There are some crimes, that if there's the existence of a weapon, there's higher crimes for that. But I don't really feel like I have the expertise to really open up a discussion about guns and mental illness. I did pass that on to Shante. Maybe that's a future workshop. Certainly sounds interesting. Any other questions that I'm going to hang around? Yes, no. If you have an LCSW-C, use LCSW-C. If you are an LGSW, so you just graduated, you took your first licensing test, the G has become LMSW. So if you are LGSW, you should now, as effective July 1, be using LMSW. But nothing changed for the LCSWCs. Thanks for the question. As an LCSW-C, am I liable for a community health worker who works with me? I would need, you might want to, I mean, that's more, I'd need more information to be able to answer that, but certainly anyone that you are, certainly students are working under your license, and LMSW is working under your supervision, and yes, that would be working under your license. So it would depend on your setting, but certainly anyone you're supervising, yes, you would be responsible for, but I'm happy to talk further. I'm feeling very affirmed here. Anyway, thank you very much, but I'll still stick around in case you have questions. Is there ever a policy that would go into effect in one area and not another? I don't understand the question, but I'll stick around and see. I gotta tell you, I've missed seeing you in person. Okay. I don't know if it's available to review. I imagine Shante can answer that. And I do offer workshops on confidentiality as well as ethical obligation in terms of reporting throughout the year. So if there are more like specific questions that you had on some of the content that we talked about, another workshop would allow for more detail on that. I'm especially interested in the people that were cut out a little bit, the technology. So I don't know if I'm still going to hang around in case y'all want to go back on any of the slides if you got cut out. I need to research statutes. Let me provide my email. I'm not sure I understand. There's the National Trauma, oh my goodness, what is that? Let me see if I can look that up real quick. I can't remember the, there's a national, oh my gosh, um, trauma network. I know network, isn't it? Anyway, but they have lots of information, and I know that there's some specific regulations around like the social workers that work in court settings, where what you're considering around sentencing, you know, the use of trauma history around that. And then also someone identified like around discipline, and from the Department of Education. I'd have to research that a bit. I don't have those specific sites, but I do know that in the, you know, for those social workers that are working in court settings as well as education settings, have that. And if you want to email me at the School of Social Work, I can look up that trauma. There's some phenomenal resources on the trauma network. I can't remember. It's like national. It's got too many initials, and I can't remember it. And I'm not feeling confident in pulling up a search while I'm live on this. I don't want to cut people off.
Someone asked about CEUs. CEUs will be emailed to everyone that completes the evaluation form, and they'll be emailed out on Monday.